All right, welcome to the show here at SportsStreamNetwork.com, and good to have you with us for another fine week, off to a rocking start. I'm Jeff Deforrest, and it's good to be with you. My buddy Jersey Kyle still off on the Jersey Shore. Many others now want to be a part of this program, and we're glad that you're a part of it here at SportsStreamNetwork.com. We got Jory. He's always a little bit in agony there. He's got the, furrowed brow there and, a little bit of stress. And Todd here, and they do a great job, and we're glad to have them with us here for another week. Thinking about a little time change. We'll give you news about that at the end of the show. And glad to have you with us here for this early start. Well, we were talking about this all last week, and it was the advent of pro football and the Hall of Fame game. And we were clued in on the sickness it is, the just general depravity, the fact that you should be wearing a jacket that ties in the back if you bet preseason football. And we mentioned a good friend of ours who calls into my radio show here in South Florida, which you can catch on iHeartRadio all around the country on 940 WINZ. You just pop that on, you can hear the show. It's on 6 to 10 every day, and you can kind of get the gist, get a little bit of a feel for what the subject matter is going to be on the video streams that we do on SportsStreamNetwork.com. And we were discussing how sick you have to be to bet preseason football, and of course we get a call from one of the greats all time in the terms of handicapping, and that was the legendary Stu Feiner from Proline. If you guys remember the show, might have to be a little bit of an old-timer, but this was at the very advent of cable TV. There were just a couple of networks. ESPN was relatively new, and of course the generic network that had old programming, a lot of weird stuff. You'd see McHale's Navy on there and Gilligan's Island, a lot of really crusty old shows that people enjoyed, but it certainly wasn't going to be enough to carry them over the top. And they would sell some time on a weekend to a guy named Jim Feist, who had a show called Proline, where they had the handicappers that the movie Two for the Money was based on with Matthew McConaughey. And one of the characters that was depicted in the movie was Stu Feiner, who looked like, he literally looked like a public defender. It looked like he had slept in the trunk of his car the night before he came on TV. Maybe I do too. That's quite possible. Some people have told me that already with the feedback that Jory's getting on SportsStream Network's chat room and email sites and contacts, saying, hey, that Deforrest looks like he just got pulled out of the trunk of a car. Looks like he was abducted before he came on the air. Feiner was exactly that. I mean, this was a guy that you looked at and you thought, my Lord, where did this guy come from? And he would get out of the car and start very slowly and then eventually say, but this week I have the game of my lifetime. You simply cannot lose. So he couldn't resist the temptation to call in. And he's actually pretty good. He hits at above a 50% rate, at least he did last year, college and pro football. And he's come up with some good plays. He gave us the Pittsburgh Pirates over the Dodgers with Kershaw the other night, and that was a strong play, especially since Kershaw was on a streak of 37 consecutive scoreless innings. And then the very first pitch, boom, home run. The Pirates jump on him. They eventually win it in 10. And if you were inclined to agree with Stu Feiner and make a wager, you made yourself a very handsome score. So Feiner calls in to my radio show. We're talking about the depravity it takes to be a better of preseason football. And think about what we're talking about here. The Vikings, unless you had some inside information, unless you were like the guy doing the web report, you would have to be absolutely insane to think that you had an edge in this game. And yet the money was coming in, the smart money was coming in on the Minnesota Vikings, who were favored by 3.5 in the Hall of Fame game that was conducted yesterday. And people were just absolutely ignoring the Pittsburgh Steelers, who you're thinking, well, why would the Steelers be underdogs to the Vikings? They're probably a better organization, certainly a better team. They got a better quarterback, or at least a more experienced one in Roethlisberger. And we knew that Adrian Peterson wasn't going to play in the ball game. He wasn't going to suit up because it would be illogical to go ahead and play these kind of stars when you're playing 5 preseason games for any length of time. Anyway, Feiner says go ahead and unload on Pittsburgh, that he has a gut feeling that they're going to win the game. And then you look at how it's played and you're thinking you're crazy. You must be gargling with cyanide just for even considering making this wager. Because if you looked at the ball game in the Hall of Fame game, Bridgewater comes out for the Minnesota Vikings, a local kid here from South Florida, who made a name for himself in high school. Looked great when he was playing in college, did he not? Teddy Bridgewater was always being talked about right up there with any of the other quarterbacks that were taken at the time, including little Johnny Manziel, who apparently now seems to have figured out how to play professional football. But if you were watching that game, you had to get The Wells Report is what I meant to cite. Ted Wells, who does all these investigations for the National Football League, he would have had to have been the only one that knew that Minnesota was going to come out, have this funky little game plan where it looked like they were establishing some kind of rhythm on offense. They knew they were going to keep their starters in there for maybe 10, 12 plays if the drive sustained itself that long, their opening drive. And no matter what the circumstances were, if they had a 4th down and short, they were going to go for it. They were going to go for the first down. So they ended up on the 10-yard line. I think they could have even Tingelhoff, the fabled lineman for the Vikings, was inducted into the Hall of Fame. They could have started him and still been effective the way they were approaching this game. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh has Roethlisberger. He's in the stands with the Steeler faithful. I think they gave a couple of carries to the bus. They could have cared less. They shrugged this thing off as if it was as meaningless as it actually is. One of 5 preseason games. And it led to the thought that, well, what are these guys really into? Would you rather show excitement about coming to your first preseason game? Or is the real excitement the fact that, okay, 1 down, and in most cases 3 to go, and in this case 4 to go, and you're just hoping to get out of it without any significant injuries? But it was kind of interesting as you looked at the way Minnesota approached things. We did see an old friend of ours here from the Steelers by way then to Minnesota via the Miami Dolphins, who made this guy a very rich man, Mike Wallace, the wide receiver. You need speed. You can hear Mick from Rocky. You need speed. And that was a theory here for a long time, that the Miami Dolphins were continually and perennially going to suck unless they found somebody that could fly on the outside. So they get this guy Wallace. They pay him $60 million in guaranteed money, I think. He's sour about that, even though he's now, at that time, a couple of years ago, the highest paid player at the position. Wasn't like he was a second coming to Jerry Rice. But once again, this was fueled inside the general manager's head, Jeff Ireland. His job's on the line. His contract is sitting over the shredder there in Stephen Ross's office. A lot of negative sentiment about him. So he goes out, makes the bold move, which a lot of times guys that are in a jackpot, they make a move and they overdo things, and they end up overpaying, obviously, for a guy that's really not that good. And one of the things that you saw with Wallace, it wasn't like he was a quarterback's best friend. He'd be wide open, and Ryan Tannehill was a quarterback at the time, inexperienced guy, first year in the league. He was one of those guys that was waving as if he was making a fair catch. He was that wide open. The cornerback had fallen down 20 yards ahead of the play. He's standing there wide open, and then Tannehill would throw some knuckler up there, one of those things that looked like it should have been shot down on the wide, or the American Sportsman, right? Where they got like 3 drunks out there cooking by some river going, we had a good day out there, just absolutely fantastic, and they're shooting quail right out of the sky. And you're thinking, nobody could throw that ugly of a pass. It's absolutely ridiculous. And there's Wallace in the game, and one of the problems he had is even sometimes when the ball was on the money, he would drop it. He wasn't necessarily an Odell Beckham Jr. or one of these guys that's going to make sensational catches, a Victor Cruz or a Dez Bryant that was going to save the quarterback from an embarrassing throw. More likely to have it hit off the top of his helmet, bounce up in the air, become an interception, some feigned effort to make a tackle, and then the guy goes down the sidelines and blitzes his way for a touchdown. So he's in the game, and sure enough, one of the plays in that first drive, Bridgewater makes a bad pass. It's behind the guy, and we all know how difficult that is. Got to reach behind you. You're looking to catch the ball over here. It's down here. And naturally, with the hands of stone, the Manos de Piedro, the Roberto Duran syndrome, Wallace drops the football. And that, I think, actually it was Bridgewater's only incompletion in the first quarter of that game where he played the 12 snaps. So you're looking at Minnesota and thinking to yourself, my God, these guys are just almost mad scientists in here, game planning for it. They're sending blitzes at the quarterback, the backup who started for Pittsburgh. And it was pretty clear cut that one team had the attention to go out there and do some good, and the other team could care less. They would put any bag lady in there that they could find and could care less about the outcome of the game. So that's the problem with preseason football if you're wagering. Our man Stu Feiner told us Minnesota, he did hit the under in that ball game because there were few points scored. I think the final was 14-3. It ended up being pretty dreadful once they got the Scribinis in there, but it's tough to say. I mean, this is always an interesting proposition. Is there any indication that you can get about your team when watching preseason football? The Dolphins here in town going to go against the Chicago Bears. They're 1-point underdogs on Thursday night. You're asking yourself, why, Deforrest? Why have you looked into that? And it's not because I'm willing to make a wager. I'm just curious to see how even the line makers approach the preseason, where some people swear, as Stu Feiner did, that this was money in the bank. I guarantee you my Super Platinum Gold Seal Double Wheel Perfecta Player of the Century will win this weekend, and you can get it by calling my hotline. We should establish one of those here. We can give you a loser every week. And you know what? If we give you a loser, how about this? We give you the rest of the season free. That's always comforting to know. Anyway, it turned out to be a little bit of a thrill to see football back in action. And, of course, all the teams start their preseason this week. And like I said, you're just hoping somebody doesn't get hurt. The kicker was very efficient for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Is it Sweetum? He ends up hurting a knee. And Mike Tomlin, the coach of the Steelers, said, well, this might be a lot more serious than we think. So we're a little worried about that. This was a guy that kicked at a 91% ratio successful field goals last year. And with the new emphasis moving the extra point back, which is something I don't really like, they are going to have to be a lot more consistent from that 31, 32-yard range, because essentially now that's where the kick's going to come from, 32, 33 yards, where, by the way, unfortunately, locally here, our kicker, Caleb Sturgis for the Miami Dolphins, kicks the ball like he just inserted, never mind Deflategate. It seems like he's inserted a gyroscope into the football. It is absolutely that bad. But that also came on the heels of the Hall of Fame induction ceremonies. They changed it up a little bit. Now it's all video presenters, and there was some controversy. We talked about it on the show last week about Junior Seau and his induction into the Hall of Fame. I feel this way about it in all sincerity, and I know we clown around a lot on the show here, and that's what we're here to do, is have some fun and hopefully entertain you people, get some feedback on a thing, answer your questions, whatever it is that you're looking for. But the controversy turned out to be just totally irrelevant, as there's a time and a place for certain agendas to be explored. You saw how upset and uneasy people were made when Michael Moore, the film producer, Bowling for Columbine, Fahrenheit 451, a bunch of documentaries where he essentially goes out there to make a fool of guys like Charlton Heston. And he does a very good job of that, and the documentaries are fun. They may be a little bit too self-indulgent, but I thought Bowling for Columbine was very well done, where he was talking about gun sales. And, of course, he's one of these types, kind of a goofy-looking version of Mike Wallace. You know the guy I'm talking about, a little bit rotund, got a goofy-looking hat, looks like it should have a propeller coming out of the top. And he wins an Oscar for the documentary Bowling for Columbine. Well-deserved, richly deserved. It was a great piece of work, and I thought very effective and should have had some impact. If it didn't then, certainly it should be relevant now, because if anything, it's gotten scarier. You can't even go to the grocery store anymore without some guy coming in there with an Uzi or fearing that something like that's going to happen, where he's going to get some head cheese and then gun everybody down that's standing there waiting for a half a pound of tuna fish salad. And that's frightening. It was a much kinder, gentler world back when we were growing up in the 50s and 60s, or at least I was, where the big deal was, hey, Richie D'Angelo has a slingshot. You know, when he's in school and the principal's involved and the cops come in and you're thinking, slingshot, you'd take that any day right now. Some guy shooting a paperclip around. You could lose an eye. Right? That's what they always say. You could lose an eye. But you would take that any day over this nonsense, this absolute insanity that goes on today with you can't even go to an empty movie theater, 8 people in that theater in, West Virginia? Where you're going in to see a matinee, you just want to blow off an hour of steam, maybe divorce yourself, disconnect from all the pressures that you're facing, and now you got to worry whether some maniac's going to come in there with a gun and shoot everybody down. That's absolutely insane, and that should never happen. And more, there's a time and a place. He made the movie, he won the Oscar, but he gets up there and uses the platform for his own political agenda, which... Okay, you got a bunch of celebrities patting themselves on the back for being rich and famous. I understand. I mean, it's not a serious ceremony, even though they act about it like it's the most sanctimonious thing that ever happened. I mean, you would think that they were conducting some kind of religious ceremony. And, meantime, they're just like finding another reason to party and spend a lot of money and wear expensive clothes and jewelry that they borrowed off a guy that probably would be hanging in some L.A. pawn shop within a week after the Oscars are awarded. So there's a time and a place for everything, and I would have thought it would be inappropriate for the Seau family. I thought it would be more damaging to the memory and the image that people have, the impression that people have of Junior Seau, if they got up there and said, "You killed my dad." I didn't think that was going to happen. You killed my dad, and I don't know that that was ever really something that the family was considering, having some kind of speech being made. Much was made of the whole idea that there was this new rule in place where you couldn't have people be live presenters of inductees that were being inducted posthumously. And of course, Junior Seau sadly took his own life after suffering whatever dementia comes along or depression comes along with having your head concussed over and over and over and over again. And apparently this what was a significant aspect of it, because on the surface he appeared to be a very happy and well-adjusted individual. He was always talking to the crowd, very gregarious with everybody, and had some bizarre music coming in here. Oh, that's Jory's phone. All right. So anyway, we'll press on, and as this thing, just I don't know if you guys are picking that up, but it's kind of radical. Anyway, stop calling Jory or Todd. But you know what? We'll take a quick time out and see if we can get that thing adjusted. We'll get back to our thing about the Hall of Fame induction ceremonies. I'm Jeff Deforrest here on SportsStreamNetwork.com. And, okay, it's cleared up, at least temporarily. A little bit of a weird working thing, and we're working on some of the problems here. Anyway, the induction ceremony, they couldn't have addressed it with any more class, any more dignity. This Cindy Seau that supposedly the NFL was all worried about, she couldn't have been any more impressive. And the feeling, the impression that you got as you were listening to her speak about Junior Seau, you left that ceremony and watching it, whether you were watching it on TV or for the many people, thousands of people that happened to be there live in Canton, Ohio, you couldn't help but feel genuine affection for Junior Seau. And I thought they handled it with a lot of dignity. It would have been way out of bounds. Somehow we're getting all kinds of extraneous noises and problems going on in here, and I don't know if we're on. I don't know.
You're fine, but I gotta laugh.
Yeah.
You said about the distractions, and I just said to Todd, "You think that's a distraction?" My phone's playing Ozzy Osbourne.
Yeah. I didn't know what was going on. I thought maybe it was coming from the source here. All right, no problem. And like I said, I thought the thing was handled with a lot of dignity, a lot of style, a lot of class, and that's the way that it should have been, as the Hall of Fame ceremonies are for that. And you know what? If there was some separate agenda where the family wanted to then speak about what happened to Junior Seau and how football impacted him, and then it was wrong of the NFL to conceal some of the medical information that they had. I mean, they're paying a price for it. A lot of people are not satisfied with the price. I think it's more a situation where you have to decide whether you want to sanction this stuff at all in America, and I don't know that this country is ready to have football disappear. So as long as that's happening, you're going to have concussions, you're going to have head injuries, you're going to find out about this kind of trauma long after these guys have retired, and there are going to be still incidents no matter what they do to prevent it, with a little bit more awareness about it right now, and that's going to go on for as long as they're playing the game. It's a violent game, and there's just no way around it. Along those lines, one of the other things that happened, Frank Gifford, Hall of Famer, passed away yesterday. And 84 years old, the man lived a great life, 17 years on Monday Night Football. People forget what a great player he was also. One of my memories, and my Uncle Joey, who was the only sports fan in my family, said, hey kid, you want to go to a pro football game? We didn't care that much about pro football then. This was probably circa late 50s, 1959 maybe. An 8-year-old Deforrest gets invited to a pro football game. And for me, it was more of a thrill to go to Yankee Stadium to see any sport, being a big baseball fan, than it was to go and actually experience pro football for the first time. So I go there, and at the time, Allie Sherman is the coach of the Giants, and there's a big movement in the New York area to fire this guy. Nicest guy in the world. We saw that later on when he was in the Edge Monday night matchup, as they used to do a pregame kind of for the Monday Night Football game on another network. This was on some obscure network, right, where you would see some oddball show, bunch of infomercials. You're seeing products that will help you grow your hair back, even if you're a rock, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, this Edge Monday Night Football would come on, and Allie Sherman, a former coach of the Giants, was a very lovable and affable character on that show, and had some pretty good insights into what was going on in the games. But unfortunately, after a decent run with the Giants, he fell into disfavor, and I still to this day have my little Goodbye Allie pennant that I had hung on the wall in my bedroom when I was a kid, and somewhere I think my mother's got it stashed, and I doubt that it has any value, but it certainly has sentimental value. And in that game, Frank Gifford is one of the key performers for the New York Giants. The other thing that's odd, people forget also that at that time, and Frank Gifford was so versatile as a player, great running back at USC, great running back in the pros, pass catcher, he could throw the ball a little bit, do just about everything. And he also played defense. He was a defensive back in his early tenure in the National Football League. So tremendous player, and that was kind of lost because he also had a very significant broadcasting career and passed away at 84 very suddenly, I guess. Must have had a heart attack or something in his sleep. I'm not a doctor. I just play one on TV. But the cause of death was given as natural causes, came very suddenly. There wasn't any great anticipation of it. It wasn't like he had the big casino and he was in some kind of care or treatment for a long period of time, and it eventually, just got to him and his body wore out. Just check, please, and he's gone. Which shows you, people, live every day as best you can, because you never know. You just never know when your number is up. But Gifford, he was one of the pioneers there. He wasn't the original play-by-play voice of Monday Night Football, but was part of a lot of great teams on Monday Night Football, including, obviously, the greatest of all time in the history of the series, where he was kind of the metronome, the mediator between and the go-between between Howard Cosell and Dandy Don Meredith. And those guys were terrific. And that was, I would have to say that was the height of the broadcast. Our own good friend, dear friend, the lovely and talented Leslie Visser, became a sideline reporter with the crew. And she said this to me. She was talking about Frank Gifford, gave me a call yesterday after the news of his passing, and said, you wouldn't find a guy that was more personable and conducted himself with more class and dignity. And I was glad she said that, because people right away continue to, just go back to this one incident where he sort of, I don't know if it was a disgrace so much, but because who knows what triggered this. He cheated on Kathy Lee Gifford. A lot of people would say, if you saw her in those commercials for that cruise line, you would have left her also. And immediately started banging that stewardess or whatever it was, that flight attendant that he was having the affair with. And I don't know what level of shame he felt about that. Somehow Kathy Lee Gifford and Frank were able to stay together. She seemed to be sincerely moved, as all of her friends around her were, at his passing. And they seemed to be one of those rare couples. Can we qualify the Clintons in there, or do we really believe that Hillary doesn't mind the whole Monica Lewinsky thing? I think, that was more of a facade than this was, where it seemed like they actually worked out whatever problems they had and were able to stay together. But if you'll remember, speaking of concussions in Junior Seau, probably the most significant crushing hit in NFL history, and there have been a lot of them, right? Remember Joe Theismann breaking his leg there with, Marty Lyons out of Alabama. And there have been many other gruesome injuries that we've seen. We've seen them in other sports, but I don't know that there's ever been a more gruesome hit in NFL history. You can go to YouTube and pop this up, and that is the Chuck Bednarik hit in 1960 on Frank Gifford of the New York Giants. A complete blindside, skull-crushing blow. And to show you the class and dignity that Gifford displayed, he never got up and pointed fingers at Bednarik. Bednarik kind of, he had other greatness and aspects to his career that would make you know him as an outstanding player and a Hall of Famer. But it might have been one of the meanest, toughest defensive players that ever played the game, with apologies to all of the people we're more modernly familiar with, like Ray Lewis and, even in between that, Ray Nitschke. This Bednarik was one tough son of a gun. But Gifford, to his credit, never took any shots at Bednarik, said never implied, that was a cheap shot and we all know it and this guy's a disgrace to the game. He actually said years later that had it been him and the situation reversed, if he was on defense and Bednarik had the ball, he would have done exactly the same thing. So that was nice to see the dignity and class that this man lived his life with. Had some people calling in this morning on the radio show, and they were saying that, you know what, I ran into Frank Gifford, I was down in the stands, I had a little kid with me, I was asking to get some autographs, and, the guy was very gracious, came over, signed every autograph, patted every little kid on their head, said hello to their grandmothers, and just was a class act all the way through. So the sports world losing one of its titans in Frank Gifford, great player, probably not remembered as such even though he made the Hall of Fame. And then on top of that, very distinguished broadcast career. I didn't realize how many events he did. This was a guy that was doing Olympics. He was the play-by-play caller of the 1980 Olympic game between a basketball game, the now infamous one between the USA and the then USSR, Soviet Union, which, who was refereeing that game? you would have to think it was Tim Donaghy, the guy that was paid off by the. Can we mention a Genovese family without getting into any trouble? It always seems like it's the Genoveses that are the families of so-called mob crime families that are having the most fun. They're the ones that are running the strip clubs. They're the ones that are involved in sports betting and gambling enterprises. And sure enough, there was a Tim Donaghy, and what was his big fear? Well, I had to do it. I had to fix these games because there were two guys there from the Genovese crime family, and they were betting the games heavily, and if I didn't get them out, it was going to be curtains for me. So, if you look at it, absolutely bizarre, some of the things that happened over the weekend, and very interesting stuff all the way around. Yankees, if you're the Yankees, are you not thinking Satchel Paige right now? Don't look back. Somebody might be gaining on you. And you kind of laughed at some of the moves that were made by the Toronto Blue Jays and other teams around the trade deadline, thinking, well, that's very noble of them. Their management is committed enough, even though they spent a lot of money before the season to be contenders. Their management is actually going out there and making a move to win one of the wild card spots in Major League Baseball. And at first, I was opposed to the expansion of the Major League Baseball playoffs. I thought that was a real bogus move, just a money grab like we see in all sports. They added in a couple of years ago an extra wild card team, and I thought there already are enough teams in there. And they made it a one-game playoff. The two wild card teams are involved in a one-game playoff. Whoever wins that gets into a series and then gets a chance to get into a little bit of a groove. Because on a day-to-day basis, anything can happen in baseball. As we saw, Kershaw. 37 scoreless innings streak, first pitch in the game against the Pirates, boom, home run. It's out of the park. So the one-game proposition is a little scary, and what it did is actually not only did it fuel the fact that there would be more teams involved in the playoff race, it also created the desire for teams that were sort of on the cusp there to make some moves. The Mets did it, although they need to win their division if they're going to make the playoffs. It doesn't look like they're going to be contenders for a wild card, so if the Nationals pass them, that's it, sayonara Subway Series. The Mets would be out of it. And then on top of that, it added emphasis to the idea of winning the division. You'll remember like in the AL East, for example, when the Yankees and the Red Sox were competing heavily at the top. Whatever team didn't win the division was making the playoffs anyway, and there was no real punitive aspect to it, except that maybe you wouldn't have home field in the last series, but you were going to make the playoffs, you were going to qualify, you could rest your players and start aligning yourself for the postseason because it didn't matter if you won those games. Now it makes a big difference. There's an added emphasis on winning the division, and that one-game playoff is a scary proposition. You could be a great team, finish second in your division, end up in a one-game playoff, have your guy go out there on a day where he's ice cold on the mound, and end up watching the postseason from the sidelines from that first game on. So I think they did. Oddly enough, as much as I was opposed to it being old school and you didn't want to see the traditional stuff change anymore or be bastardized by having so many teams in the playoffs like they do in hockey and basketball where more than half the teams are in the postseason, this worked. This is one of the few times where the greed and avarice that was really at the bottom of this move that was driving Major League Baseball actually worked to their advantage, and they created a more exciting and more compelling regular season. And then afterwards, obviously the postseason is going to take care of itself, but they also have that added tweak of getting those two wildcard teams games in the National and American League. And you have to be on pins and needles if you're fans of either of those teams, and you also have to be all in invested if you're one of those teams, and then that might mess you up for aligning your players and your pitching staff, especially for future rounds of the playoffs. So pretty good stuff all the way there. Now, in the meantime, the Blue Jays go out, they spend some money. You're thinking that's all they're looking for, that they just want to become one of those teams that's going to be in that one-game playoff because that's all they had to shoot for. The Yankees, it was bang, zoom to the moon, Alice. They were gone. They were up 6.5 games just a couple of weeks ago on the Blue Jays, and that was their closest pursuers in the American League East. Baltimore looked like they were lollygagging. The other teams, Boston took a big dive around the All-Star break. All of a sudden went into an abyss. They tanked, and it was all over for them. And so you had kind of a runaway and hide situation with the Yankees and everybody else trying to shake it out and maybe get that wild card spot for the privilege of being in a one-game playoff. So Toronto goes out there. They already had like a ton of offense, and they make the trade Jose Reyes for Troy Tulowitzki. They get Tulowitzki, a much better and more consistent hitter, and at this point in his career, a much more reliable player, even though he's had his injuries. Reyes, you know what's going to happen with Jose Reyes, as talented as he may be. He's going to run out, try to leg out some triple in spring training. The hamstring's going to go, and that's going to be it. Out for the season. Thank you, Jose. Check, please. It's all over. So here they make that move, and everybody's like scratching their heads saying, well, what the hell are they thinking? They already got a ton of offense. They need pitching. And then they swing the deal as Detroit was waffling, going back and forth, whether or not they wanted to be all in and try to make a playoff push. They were kind of sitting there on the fence. They decide they've already caved. They go ahead. They trade off their star players, Cespedes to the Mets, and David Price ends up pitching for the Blue Jays. And so you're thinking, wow, that's a pretty bold move there. That's a lot of expense to take on to just perhaps get a shot at the wild card. Well, Yankees go ice cold. All of a sudden, it looks like they're swinging Balsawood at the plate. Teixeira, A-Rod, everybody just ice cold. Pitching was always suspect. And the Blue Jays start creeping in there. They get on an 8-game run, including the El Sweeperoo over the weekend of the New York Yankees. So now it's a 1.5 differential. It's game on. And very dicey. Would look like it had a realistic chance of possibly being a Subway Series Mets-Yankees. A lot to go through to get there. Now has people thinking, what was Brian Cashman doing sitting on his ass when the trade deadline came? They probably needed to tinker with it, because here were the Blue Jays making bold moves. And sure enough, it is Satchel Paige time now, because if you're a New York Yankee fan, I think they're hiding in paranoia somewhere. I think they're submerged under the ground. But if you're a Yankee fan, you have to ask yourself if you really want to turn your neck and look over your shoulder and see what's tracking in there behind you. So that got very exciting over the weekend as well. All right, we're going to take a short time out here on SportsStreamNetwork.com. I'm Jeff Deforrest, coming to you live from the home of Defo. Right here, Jory's working the controls. He's got everything under control, running smoothly, and our good friend Todd is outside. He's engineering things, and he's probably calling his bookie right now going, hey, give me everything I got on the 8. And they tell him, that's always a tough thing to be informed about, that your account happens to be empty, sir. You'll have to visit a local bank and refuel it. Or could we have your credit card number? Or somebody else's that happens to be nearby you at the table you're at in the restaurant. But we'll come back. We have a lot more things to talk about here on the show, more football and a lot of other things on the table here today. I'm Jeff Deforrest. Be with you until about 5:15 today with a new start time, and we'll have our new big announcement coming up about tomorrow's show just in a few seconds. So stick with us a couple of minutes. We'll be back and come back and get some of your thoughts on what's going on in the world of sport today as well. Back in a moment on SportsStreamNetwork.com.